those of you who don't know me, I'm Jasmine Raymond. I work at DIA. And I invited Shannon with Sarah Tucker, my colleague in IT and with me in curatorial to, well, Sarah has been running this program of the web art projects at DIA for 15 years. For those of you who have been online and have seen the past projects, they date back to people like Francis Alice, Glenn Ligon, and a whole bunch of others, Shimabuku, back when the internet was an unknown territory. But one of the exciting things when I came to DIA about 3 years ago now, it's going to be this year, third year, September, that I thought that it's really important to continue pushing this question about what does it look like to make art on the internet, and what could a web project involve. And so when we thought to invite Shannon Ebner, one of the kind of rule of thumbs is to invite an artist who doesn't work with the web or hardly visits it or something like that. Like we've been trying to go for those outside of that medium, and knowing very well that it presents some challenges because you have to kind of turn on another part of your brain to get there. And so I'm curious to hear, now that you've seen it and conquered that territory, how was it?
Well, I guess I first want to just thank you, and also Sarah Tucker and Chad Klopfer and Jeff Ramsey, who I worked with the designing of the site. And it's really great to work with all of you on this project. No, it was really challenging. And Jasmine said that she couldn't say this, but she said it to me so I can say it. She was just saying a moment ago that that this is, she thinks of this kind of format as almost like a detox or cleansing for artists, which I have to say, that's pretty apropos. There's something about trying to work in this non-material form that's so much about kind of feeding content that is really challenging. Mm-hmm. So I think I had to go through, you know, different incarnations of the project and what it would be, and you know, would I sort of feed this thing content or not, and exactly what that meant, because naturally any project will have a kind of content, but something about the way the web is supposed to be a kind of crawling experience where you actually move through a series of kind of non-material kind of screen surfaces, and something unfolds and builds, and you know, I kind of did a real about face at one point where I realized, like, I don't have to do that, you know, and that's really liberating. Mm-hmm. And so coming out the other end of it, you know, has been good. But I think maybe you invited me to do this. I feel like it could have been, was it 2 years ago or a year and a half ago?
A year and a half ago.
Yeah. So, which is a little bit common. Like I can sort of. Yeah. You know, not really, you know, it takes me a long time to really come to terms with a project like this.
And there were various versions.
Yeah, there were 2 or 3 different versions. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I think we are very excited about it. And one of the things that made me immediately see in this last version, in this the final work, the final result, is how close it is to poetry. And then I was reminded that you have an inclination for it, mm-hmm. besides your affection to language in general, but to poetry in particular. Yeah. And there was that beautiful piece, I thought, Christy Lage did for you in Freeze a couple of years ago, that addresses this question of black and white photography as perhaps sharing what Smithson said about poetry, that it was this dying language, but not yet dead. And I thought about this funny quote that Deleuze will say, that everybody should have poetry as vitamins, and even if you're old, you should take. If you take poetry, you are okay. You will be okay.
That's nice.
And so it really helped me, because when I saw the letters and what you want us to do as we grab them or sort of improvise this accumulation, then there's a chance effect that generates this language. Can you talk a little bit about maybe your background or your encounter with language and poetry, like words?
Sure. Yeah, sure. Well, I feel like, let's see. In a way, I mean, when I lived here in the 90s, I was involved very briefly, with what was happening in poetry at the time. Mostly through Eileen Miles and these kind of unaffiliated workshops that she would do. By unaffiliated, I just mean that they weren't through a university or a college. They were really just, publicly private. I mean, it was it was the beginning of the internet. So I literally remember like pulling off one of those tabs from PS 122, where she would kind of like canvas and try and get, people like me to take these workshops. And so they were in different artist studios, a pretty interesting group of different people. And she really kind of collected artists. I mean, she came out of the sort of like New York poets and painters tradition. And so I did that for a couple of years, and it was really, I think because I was so young and it was such uncharted territory, it was really exciting. But then again, like the older I get, it's the funny thing about time, because, the time that I spent doing that becomes incrementally like smaller, sort of the older I get. So, and at the time I was reading a lot of poetry and going to readings regularly. I have found over the years that I almost feel like I end up reading more about poetry and writing than I do sometimes the writing itself, which is something I'm always trying to come to terms with, and has a lot to do with this piece in a lot of ways, and the title of the piece too. But
tell us how you arrived to the title, because for a while we had
different titles.
Different titles.
You might have noticed the postcard has a Y and an N on it. That is a demonstration of how wild language is. Well,
were you quoting somebody? Were you thinking of Gertrude Stein?
The language is wild? No, I mean, it's kind of a few different things with the title. Kind of coalescing. I mean, on the one hand, it had to do with, I'd recently kind of just gotten really interested in trying to think about this idea of an unrested image. And, and it was just something that I started thinking. It was just a kind of term that I sort of thought about one day, and started thinking immediately more in terms of the depiction, like images that, might show things at rest. Like there's a image that I'm really obsessed with for years now by Lee Friedlander that has from Egypt, with pyramids and the Sphinx and these wonderful telephone poles and a really like exaggerated foreground of just garbage and dogs just resting, in this landscape. So you have this total just collapse of time. So thinking about, starting from this place, thinking about depiction, like, what is an image that depicts rest or depicts unrest, socially, politically. And then I sort of landed on this idea of unrested, and then have started trying to, sort of understand for myself that the concept very much lies outside depiction entirely. And I guess it kind of dovetailed with, you know, reading this book that Susan Howe wrote called Birthmark that deals with this idea of a kind of wilderness of American literature. And it's this kind of, you know, she's this amazing poet who, you know, writes books of poems, but also is very much a kind of historian in her own right. And so she's kind of looking at this question of, you know, what is an American voice? You know, where does a kind of American voice come from? And so she looks at all these devotional texts and you know, ways that different figures kind of stood outside the church and were kind of cast out from their own, you know, communities in New England, and eventually, you know, lands on one of her great subjects, which is Emily Dickinson, and eventually kind of talks about this idea of a kind of undomesticated language that, you know, Dickinson by scholars is constantly kind of domesticated. That all of her like kind of wild punctuation and wild kind of spacing, that the poems themselves exist as kind of visual objects, but that every scholar just completely undoes that.
Second guessing her? Second guessing?
Well, just trying, I think, to normalize the writing itself and make it really just legible for an academic readership. And so I was, you know, trying to think about, well, you know, how can one have a kind of, you know, how can punctuation in a photograph kind of function that way? Like there are a lot of elements in the site where I've literally tried to unrest key elements from images. One thing happened with, you know, Chad, just looking at the images. Let's see if we can find it. It'll come up. We have to get there. But it's an image basically of these jigs, just what you would use in a wood shop so you wouldn't cut your fingers off, that I had photographed. And he commented on the shadows. And so kind of extracting the shadows from the jigs. And then eventually I turned them into this kind of yes-no, but thinking about, you know, an unrested image in that way, like taking an element of time from an image and lifting it and placing it, you know, in another environment. Anyways, I guess so that's one. So this idea of language being wild was about trying to think about the ways that photographs and language don't necessarily have to behave, that they can kind of exist in this undomesticated space. So, yeah.
And then can we talk a little bit about the speed, right? There's this.
Yeah.
Right. We have to be special.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah, there's the demonstration of the cursor. Yeah, I mean, the speed, this is the third piece that I've made like this. And I know I've got one more in me. It's going to change in certain regards, but maybe not in others.
Were you thinking of Morse code? Does that carry through? Or?
Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
Those are the shadows from the jigs. Got to catch it while you can. Wait, what was I saying? Oh, the speed. Yeah, I mean, the speed. So yes, I've made a few pieces like this. And, you know, I've been interested in, you know, issues of legibility or, you know, trying to sort of disrupt readability in images, and just thinking about the way images can so exist in time and place and be so identifiable that, you know, this is a photograph from this time, and because it has these kind of locators in it of place and time. And so I think with this, with the legibility issue, I was interested in just how the speed of thought, or the speed of the brain trying to actually keep pace with the language, you know, with the mind being able to kind of keep pace with the images and eventually, what's it called? I think it's called parsing. You know, well, there's another idea which has to do with this idea of a garden path sentence, which is, I guess they call it like a psycholinguistic term, and it's a kind of sentence that when you begin reading it, you start out on your path and you think it's saying one thing, but in fact, because the brain builds these words through the parsing, you're following this train of thought, but then in the garden path sentence, it diverges and it becomes actually about something different from how it started. But there's usually something within the sentence structure that literally acts as a fork in the road. And I'm sure you've all had this experience when you're reading and all of a sudden you hit a garden path sentence and you have to literally pause and kind of go back and figure out that you're going to now take this new direction. And so...
so this unpredictability.
Yeah, or indeterminacy. But I think it also had a lot to just do with this idea of like the cognitive and the perceptual and trying to... you know, figure out a way to apply a different kind of time to looking at images, because I think that, you know, ultimately these are all photographs, and so, you know, they are moving damn quickly, but, but you know, if you have the patience to watch it through a few rotations, I think you can usually, you can pick up the pace and you can actually start to. But,
and then that's, yeah, now we see, for those who haven't done it yet, that's what occurs when you click on the arrow.
Yeah, so when you pause and the cursor pauses the frame, then if you go to the top right arrow, it's collected all of the images that your cursor has paused on.
In that sense, that accumulation it's also a progression.
Yeah.
You're progressing and then accumulating.
Right, yeah. You know, originally it was going to be this idea of these kind of pop-up windows. You know, like if you go to like a porn site or something, right? And then at the end, when you close your window, it's like, uh-oh, what did I do? You know, there's just like all these little like windows, advertisements. And so we were really intrigued by this idea of doing that. And then it was like with programming, couldn't quite, you know, figure that out. So this was this other like very elegant solution, which as it turns out is much more exciting to me in terms of just trying to think about a photographic sentence. And
it ties nicely with your involuntary sculpture. It's sort of like an involuntary writing.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that takes...
And the pauses also... you know, because in between each image, I mean, one thing that's been kind of really useful about making this project is that I realize how weirdly and kind of like stupidly the PowerPoint software is important to this idea of a kind of photographic sentence and trying to literally write with images. And I don't know if there's a poster in the back to the left, this kind of scroll that's on the wall back there. And that's every frame from the website. So you could actually read it, but I've been interested in this idea of trying to think about a photographic sentence and, you know, when is a photographic sentence a sentence to photograph? And so something about this collecting of images and these kinds of the space in between each letter that, you know, the luck of the draw is that when you actually activate that cursor, you're going to land on one of the spaces in between the letters, and they're going to actually accumulate, you know, on the next page, which is really interesting to me. The way these kind of pauses and commas actually determine the kind of, you know, layout of the photographic language. It's pretty thrilling for me, but.
And for me, I think immediately when I first saw the images of the pegboard with the blocks, there's this, I imagine you doing it, right?
Yeah.
I imagine you lifting them and putting them, and there's this physical involvement on laying them out. And this is something that I'm still not sure how I want to formulate this thought, but it's sort of an investment, a physical investment on your part that carries a protest almost. Like, I feel like you're putting, this is an S, this is an R. And I wonder how that also then, how was it for you? Or how is it for you in general when you're making the work with these blocks? And what are some of the impulses that make you go there physically? Because then later we see them as images, and that's, or in some occasions we've seen them as sculpture, but how does that play with you in your method?
Well, you know, I mean, I actually made the system and made the images of the strike alphabet in 2007. And at the time, it had a lot to do with, you know, wanting to bring a kind of physical weight to language, and also, like that there would be something at stake that, you know, with the cinder blocks, I always say that, you know, that they will literally cut your throat. I mean, the photograph kind of tames them, but in fact, when you handle them, they're brutal. And, you know, so I, at that point, was kind of having this really, like, fitful relationship to this idea of having a polemic in the work. And I had made, you know, a body of work that very literally addressed, you know, the preemptive war with Iraq and the bombing of Afghanistan and with the DDL series. And then I'd made another body of work that was a little bit more ambivalent about
Martin Luther King.
About its role with politics. And I think after making that body of work, it's called The Sun and the Side, I really made this kind of conscious decision that I wanted to work on something that was going to, again, sort of very directly try and address all the things that, you know, we were involved in, the U.S. was involved in, the Bush administration was involved in. So I knew I wanted to work with this kind of modular system, and that for me, these bricks really could kind of be a sort of first world, third world kind of material, and they had this kind of universality to them.
And potential of building something, right?
I mean, I mean, you know, I always kind of like joke now that, you know, I'm sort of like this perverted, like, you know, like word toucher that, like, of course, you know, I had to do the whole friggin' thing myself. You know, I mean, I didn't make the, like, steel peg system, but I didn't have anybody help me, like, put those blocks. And it was really, you know, I mean, it was, to lift them, like, above my head, whatever. It was just, it was really intense. But then the thing that I'm trying to get at is then once I photographed them and kind of had them, as this sort of like readily available photographic alphabet, then the physicality became about the physicality in the photograph. And so it's, you know, so when I made the strike alphabet, the reason why I call them the strike alphabet is because I ended up using them for this piece. I guess in a way it was like the first thing I'd done that really, it was like a lot of language. It was this piece called Strike that was 18 palindromes that I, you know, kind of continually broke with a black slash that's up here, trying to sort of break this form. And it very literally, very directly, you know, dealt with the war. You know, but since that time, I've continued to kind of use them. I mean, I hope I've always tried to sort of use them responsibly in a way. I mean, when I set out to make them, I'm not like a sort of like pure conceptualist. I didn't know what they were going to end up being used for. But once I did use them for that piece, and it was sort of a larger piece, you know, I had to really wrestle with, you know, were they just going to sort of be like retired for that strike piece, or was I going to continue to use them? And it's an ongoing question. I'm trying to retire them, and I thought that they were not going to be part of this project at all. And then the weird thing is that they always end up coming. Yeah, I mean, I don't, I want to move on from them, but ultimately, yeah.
Well, they seem to have done their service for this one, huh? Let's give them some credit.
Yeah.
And your muscles.
Yeah, right. I should keep, if I'd probably stop faster if I did keep making them as I made work.
Should we let other people ask questions?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, we said 5 minutes, but I think we went through a little bit longer. Anybody wants to ask Shannon some questions about the work, past works, how this work came about? Yeah?
Just curious if you think you'd ever want to work in the media again.
Chad, Jeff.
I don't know. I really don't know if I'd ever want to. Not so soon, I mean, I'd never say never, but I think what's really interesting about this is that it is an artist project. It's obviously not like a site that's about, unfortunately, when we think of websites, it's always sort of in the service of some sort of commerce or some sort of like, exposure and things like that. And I think what's wonderful about this project is that it's a discrete artist project, like an artist book is an artist project. And that would, kind of forever appeal to me. But, having wrestled with it, I'm pretty happy to be like, done. And don't really, I don't know.
But can I drive you back into the past rather than...
Sure. I'm at the mercy of these questions, so.
Curious, as a frustrated philologist, I was curious whether you actually did specific research into the invention of the alphabet. Because you two, as somewhat Hebraic scribes, people may have noticed, actually go back to a very specific moment where a non-central civilization invents letters. And that just transformed. In fact, all the alphabets, including Greek and Roman, derive from these, not even Jewish people, because Judaism didn't exist, they were just the Semites. And they invented a 20-letter alphabet, which completely transformed civilization. So I'm just curious how far very modern research.
I think I'd say I usually do kind of research by proxy, and that is a realm that I would truly love to. I mean, that fascinates me. So.
But are those there by chance? Those two scratchings?
The two scratches, yeah. The Y and the N appealed to me because of Hebrew and because they had that kind of. And even there's the two YNs. There's the kind of squiggly one.
Well, of course, in Hebrew, they have two completely different letters.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. But no, I haven't actually, except by kind of proxy, really sort of researched properly like the history of the alphabet, but I think it's...
Did you render those yourself?
No, I found them. Well, one I rendered and one I found. One is just the glue remnant from a business that is no longer, so they took their actual like foam core letter off the wall. And then the glue pattern is what exists that does, and then the other YN is made from shadows. And it also looks very much like Hebrew. Yeah. Which at one time I could read, but not anymore. But sure, I mean, looking at the hieroglyphics, of the Egyptians is infinitely fascinating, and yeah, I mean, all forms of language, but so yes, in some regards.
Well, you made the interesting step where you actually create masses of letters that are no longer alphabetic.
Yeah.
The total message.
Yeah.
The sentence is
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The photo.
In your work, and I'm wondering if that's something that came in through this project, or if there are any. I know, these images you've had for a while in your work. Some of them you've made, some of them you've found.
Right.
That circular one.
Yeah, the circular one. Yeah, that I guess is sort of this thing of like the unrested image. It's basically just extracted from a photograph that I made of from an auto body shop that has a tool rack board that looks almost, like prehistoric, or, the sort of outlines from these tools are very suggestive of, of a kind of hieroglyphic. And so I just ended up kind of thinking about the idea of like the full stop, the period or the comma. So I took 2 of those from this tool rack, and that one is from there. Yeah, I mean, I haven't done anything like that before, sort of, and I'm still trying to come to terms with it, what it means to actually sort of. These are the ones
that they're stains from the glue.
Yeah.
You're saying.
Yeah.
And then the ones that are on the postcard.
Yeah, the ones that are on the postcard are just the shadows kind of that I laid out so that they would read like a Y and an N. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Good. Yeah?
Mm-hmm. Oh.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thanks,
you,
you guys.
Shannon.
Thank you. Thanks.